today's topic, which is millennials meet menopause.
Mm.
I'm Simon Salt. I am a certified menopause coach, and I write at The Quiet Transition, and I write specifically about this issue for men and trying to translate this language into plain English for men so that they can better support their partners.
Mm.
So I want to start the conversation with a question for you, which is, when did you first realize that perimenopause wasn't decades away for your generation, but was happening now?
Mm. So millennials are in our 30s and 40s. The definition is for those born between 1981 and 1996. And a couple of years ago, I was about to be 39, approaching 40. People talk a lot about this milestone. And I really wasn't sure what that involved in terms of my health. I had barely heard the term perimenopause, even though I'm very well educated and passionate about women's health. And I went to a women's networking event, and all of the older women in the room kept saying things like, no one told me about this decades long of symptoms. No one told me how intense the symptoms could be. I wish I had known. I wish I had known. And I truly walked out thinking, okay, I've got to learn more and tell everyone. And ultimately that turned into my book project.
And so when did you start the book project?
So that was around, I started it summer 2024, and the book was published July 2025. And in the almost 2 years since I first heard about menopause, which was March or February 2024, so it's been over 2 years, I've become an expert. I have become a Menopause Society certified practitioner. I am constantly, as you are too, reading, learning, listening, going to conferences, webinars, and I also apply it in my private practice because as I age, so do my clients, whether I've been working with them for many years or they're new, and I'm able to recognize perimenopause and then help them through it, which is really rewarding and fulfilling for me.
Right. So you said you were motivated by this women's networking group. So how aware of it before that networking group were you?
Very unaware, and I am very interested in women's health, and I read a lot. I have 2 graduate degrees related to women's health and rights. I am certified in perinatal mental health, which is obviously an overlapping topic. And truly, I had barely heard or talked about menopause. I knew it meant the end of fertility. I knew it usually involved hot flashes, and honestly, that's it. And then I thought maybe it's just me and I missed, the
Mhm.
biology class. And sure enough, I discovered it wasn't. Most of my friends knew very little. And then most of my medical providers knew very little too, which is reflective of the data that we see from studies on training.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're working with uh, people at your age in the millennial space, do you come across this impression of I'm too young for this?
I do. And unfortunately, that gets reinforced by many of our medical providers who are not taught and have not yet sought out their training that I think they all need. Um, People unfortunately associate menopause with aging, and then they're afraid of aging because of cultural expectations, ageism, sexism. And really, it's a phase of life. I like to describe it as midlife health or health in your 40s or similar to adolescence, which everyone will go through, and it's okay. And it might have ups and downs, and you certainly don't need to suffer through those downs. But it's not this scary label that we need to embrace or run away from. It's just a chapter, or if you want to be punny, a period of life.
So, do you think there's an emotional whiplash? And I say this because I had a conversation with somebody a week ago, and we were talking about their experience. and their partner refused to believe they were in perimenopause, would not accept it. Over several weeks, they kept coming back to this conversation. They are millennials,
Yeah.
and he just was not having it. No, because if she's in perimenopause, he's aging.
Yeah. Well, as you're saying, I mean, my therapist analyst hat comes on, and I wonder, what is his resistance about? Is it that he doesn't want to recognize or reckon with this new chapter? Is it that he doesn't want her to use this as an excuse for certain behaviors? But I don't love the resistance, because it shouldn't be about his fear of aging. It should be about supporting her through challenges. And, he's entitled to his own challenges, but let's get through it together without that sense of disbelief. That's not a nice reaction.
No, absolutely. And I think from a man's perspective, I think even as a Gen Xer, when my wife entered perimenopause 8 years ago, I think that there is that trigger of that means she's aging, that
Yeah.
means I'm aging, and how do I feel about myself aging?
Mm,
And you mentioned this at the beginning, society's expectations of you as you age. What
yeah.
does that mean for you as you're aging? And how do you think that impacts women? Because I know how that impacts men in terms of looking at society's expectations of men. But
Mm.
what do you think about for women?
I think, very unfortunately, that our society still values youth and this idea of fertility, and associates that with women and the ideal woman. And of course, not every woman wants to or does become a mother, but every woman who reaches a certain age or phase will go through menopause. So this is something that's
Mhm.
universal, and we can't. I believe aging is a privilege, and I know that Hollywood tells us otherwise, and so do the drugstore aisles with the anti-aging products. And
Mhm.
I'm not going to sugarcoat it, because aging can be difficult for a variety of reasons, but it is also a privilege. The alternative is not good, and
Yeah.
we might as well accept it. And studies show that that acceptance is much better for our mental health and the severity of symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for men going into this as Gen Xers, certainly they're feeling pressure from workspace, they're feeling pressure from generally from society, and I think they're also exposed to, not in the same way and not to the same degree, but they're exposed to that anti-aging. There are societal idols, certainly
Yeah,
celebrities, that are held up as this is what a man in his 50s is supposed to look like.
right, right.
This is what a man in his 60s is supposed to look like. And they're held up
Mm,
as, wow, look how good they look for their age.
mhm.
And so why don't you look like that?
Yeah, we see that with Hollywood celebrities. I mean, the most handsome, stereotypically handsome actors are now getting plastic surgery done, which I am a fan of, doing whatever it is to make you feel confident. But then you can't win, because then they're getting criticized for not looking like themselves, or it doesn't look as good as they used to. And it's sad to see even the most accepted, good looking men feel the pressure to look young, because we don't appreciate aging.
Yeah. And I think that then pushes the pressure down.
Of
So
course.
people are in the
The
normal
regulars.
people,
Yeah.
yeah, are looking at that and saying, well, I should look like that. Why
Right.
don't I look like that? Yeah. So what do you think in the terms of, you talked about the group in the networking and women saying nobody prepared them for this. How does that impact in terms of millennials? Because if Gen Xers are saying, well, nobody prepared me for this, and Gen Xers have typically been, I think, when I look at them anyway, from Gen X perspective, more prepared for life.
Mm.
than Gen Xers were. Certainly the transitions in life, they're more information driven. How do you think that preparation has impacted millennials? Do you think they've been more prepared?
I think we are getting more prepared, and that's certainly why I wrote the book. It's written in a very friendly, conversational tone, full of science and evidence backed treatment options and experts from various fields of women's health, but also full of pop culture and humor and like talking to
Hmm.
a friend because I wanted it to be relatable. And I wrote it so that we could be proactive. I think many Gen X advocates, doctors, etc., have been raising a ton of awareness about menopause, which I appreciate, and I wouldn't be here if not for them. But they continue to sort of look at it retroactively, and that phrase, I wish I had known, pops up. And we
Hmm.
don't have to be retroactive in terms of our health as millennials. We do have this information in our fingertips, at our fingertips in our hands, and we can use it so that we know what to look out for if anything is new and different. We know that hormone therapy and other treatment options are available. We know what kind of medical providers to work with. And we also know the lifestyle strategies that are never too early or too late to implement, like sleep, strength training, stress reduction, all those good things.
Right. So, I mean, certainly when I've been talking to women and some doctors and specialists over the past few years, it's occurred to me that there's a cultural silence
Mm-hmm.
around not just perimenopause and postmenopause, but women's health in general. And I'm wondering how you find that in your practice with women that you're engaging with. Are they encountering that cultural silence?
Yes, and I snickered a little bit when you said that about women's health in general because our country at the moment is not in favor of women's health when it comes
Mm.
to policies, when it comes to training, when it comes to access to women's health providers. There are OBGYN deserts in many parts of the US.
Hmm.
And of course, policy wise, we have gone backwards in a lot of ways when it comes to women's health. So, this is a big problem. I would say that when it comes down to everyday living and how women, identify themselves in terms of their reproductive health. Because I'm in New York, I think there might be more openness to talking about certain things than in other parts of the country or in other cultures or religions that
Hmm.
maybe are a little more oppressive or have a sense of shame with anything related to one's body. Um, that all being said, women that I see still tend to not recognize themselves within the label of perimenopause. And I'm the one to teach them not only about the label, the diagnosis, but how our bodies work, the hormonal fluctuations, this phase of life, what to look out for when you go to the doctor and how you can explain your symptoms or ask for advice. So, in general, as a therapist, I focus on the symptoms, not the diagnosis or the label. And I
Hmm.
think that women really relate to that. And I certainly try to normalize talking about reproductive health in general. So, I do that any way that I can.
And is there a shock factor when you start to introduce those labels and then you start to introduce the symptoms beyond the classic, oh, you're going to have hot flashes?
Yes, there is surprise. I have counseled many women who were totally unaware that the menopause transition can and often, more often than not, does begin in one's 40s, who have things like frozen shoulder syndrome or the more basics that like difficulty sleeping, the irritability, the changes to one's menstrual cycle. They just don't know. And when I encourage them to track their symptoms or to talk to their mothers if they can about their mother's experiences, it's sort of like a light bulb goes off and they're able to see what I'm explaining, but no one ever spoke to them about it before, which is a real shame. And the Menopause Society does guide practitioners to open the door to this conversation beginning at age 35, just as a tool to educate and say, this next chapter might involve XYZ. As I'm 41 and none of my friends, peers, women that I speak to at events have had that conversation. So there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah. Do you find that surprising?
No, but I find it frustrating, and I used to give the providers a big break and say, well, they weren't taught, they didn't know. And now I think, well, okay, so they should know. And it's at least they should say, let me look into that for you or let me refer you. Instead, we continue to hear the you're too young or I don't know anything about that or hormones are dangerous and I'll see you next year.
Yeah, yeah. That was certainly the experience my wife had. So she entered perimenopause 8 years ago. So the conversation was starting even then, not at the where it is now. But she was dismissed by 4 doctors as no, this can't be anything. They're not. Your symptoms aren't related. So it's a UTI. It's a little bit of insomnia. It's a lack of exercise. It's your diet. You live in Georgia or you live in Texas, it's going to be hot.
Ugh, I'm sorry. That is so, and it really takes a lot of self love to push forward and to
Hmm.
demand better. And it takes resources, Many women don't have resources. They don't have support systems. They don't have financial means. They don't have the ability to take off work to visit 4+ doctors. And
Hmm.
it's really frustrating and it absolutely is unnecessary.
Yeah, and I think you raise a point there that I've worked on a little bit, where this big number gets thrown out, this $26.8 billion cost of menopause to the US every year.
Mhm.
Well, one of the things I focused on recently is the fact that that's not distributed evenly
Right.
across society. And as you just said, not every woman has the means to just take a day off work, because if they do, they lose pay
Mhm.
and they don't have access to health insurance.
Mhm.
And the fact that most treatment now is still not covered by health insurance.
Mhm.
So they're paying out of pocket for it and they can't afford that.
And that's once they access a provider who's willing to recognize what's going on and do some trial and error with treatment options. And I'm sorry that she had that experience. I have heard at upwards of 12 doctors.
Wow.
And I've heard of women going to inpatient psychiatric units because they felt suicidal and doing many, many treatment plans related to mental health, which of course is important.
Hmm.
But this one woman I'm thinking of in particular, she was in her late 40s, early 50s. And you would think that some medical provider would say, perhaps this is hormonal given your age. And it took 12 for someone to
Yeah.
say that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the numbers around that in terms of mental health, and that's another
Mm,
area where I'm very focused. I recently certified as a mental health first aider.
amazing.
Um, and I think, one of the numbers that comes to mind is that 70% of women during that perimenopausal period will have
The road.
suicidal ideation. And
Yeah.
that's just crazy to me, because, and I'm sure in part because they're not being treated properly.
Absolutely. It's so frustrating. And I often hear, am I losing my mind? Am I going crazy? And that's both based on symptoms, the brain fog, the lack of sleep, and also the response, right? If someone is constantly telling you, no, you're fine, and you're not, that is
Hmm.
going to really impact your mood and your sense of self.
Yeah. And I think that it impacts, that's where it impacts the partners as well. Certainly for me, the first 4 years, my response was, well, if it's not you because your labs are normal and the doctors are saying it's, there's no correlation between any of these things. They're all separate. It must be me.
Yeah.
And like a lot of men, personalize and internalize.
Hmm.
Do you find that happening with your partners in the millennials?
I do. A lot of the women that I work with who are in perimenopause struggle with libido, with irritability, with their own sense of identity, maybe also grief over the end of family planning. And of course, that and everything impacts their partner. And we do a lot of skills around communicating what's going on with you to your partner so that they don't personalize it or make it about them. And
Mm.
instead can be a teammate in figuring out what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I had this conversation with Heather England a
Mm,
month ago about the loss of intimacy,
yeah.
both physical and emotional.
Yes, thank you for naming that because the emotional intimacy is profound. It has profound impacts, and it's not just the physical that can make a difference.
Yeah, and certainly in my relationship, both of those declined, and for a while, for a number of years. And I think one of the important things is, and I've talked about this with people, is the grief of lost years.
Mm,
That time you don't get back when you look back on it and say, if only we had known what was going on, like that 4 year period where
mm,
there's nothing wrong with you.
right.
So it must be me. It must be what these relationship changes. What's happening? We never get that time back.
Mm,
So I think that's a big impact for couples is they realize if only we had known.
mm-hmm.
Um,
And talked about it. I think
mhm,
this is cultural dependent, but in the US, we're still a little prudish. And even with
mm,
a life partner that you maybe have been married to for decades and feel comfortable with, it can still be awkward to talk about sex and to
mhm.
check in. But I think it's important to check in, right? Without that
Yes.
pressure. And I love that emotional intimacy point because it is important to just be together and hold hands and have a date night without expectations of sexual
Mm,
intercourse or any kind of sexual activity because you do need that connection.
mhm.
And maybe women are experiencing pain because of the genital urinary syndrome of menopause. Maybe they're feeling the mental load and they're just exhausted. Maybe it's a combination of a lot of things, but checking in is always helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, you mentioned earlier about talking about the menstrual cycle and the variations. And I think that's a conversation that doesn't happen between men and women.
Mhm.
Men
Absolutely.
are just
Yes.
like, yeah, I don't need to know about that. It's too much information.
I am on a mission to change that. I was telling you earlier, I have a daughter and a son. They're school aged, and we talk about puberty and periods and all the things in a very normalized way. We do a lot of community service activities, collecting period products for women in need in our community. I have never hesitated to ask my husband and son to pick up products for me at the drugstore, and I encourage everyone to do that with the young boys in their life so that
Hmm.
it becomes normalized. And every man knows a woman, whether they're
Absolutely.
married to them, their sister, their mother, whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think beyond that, every man, certainly every man over the age of 18, but beyond that, every man knows a woman going through the menopause transition
Yeah.
without a doubt, whether they are a wife, a partner, a girlfriend,
Hmm.
a mother, a sister, a niece, or more importantly, or even a co-worker,
Yeah.
an employee, a manager. I mean, I think that's one of the things I talk about is the menopause ripples.
Yeah.
Yes, we center the woman. Absolutely, we should. But it goes beyond that. We talk about partners. We can talk about the workplace.
Yeah.
It doesn't stay just with the woman, and I think that's the big thing that we have with this conversation, even now, it's still a conversation that tends to be focused on symptoms.
Mm,
And I think it's a much bigger conversation because it isn't a woman's issue, it's a human issue.
yep.
And I
Thanks.
think we, yeah, I mean, I think that's where we need to get the conversation going. It's not just women that are impacted
Agree.
by
And
this.
I mean, it should be enough, right? Even if it's just women, because women are half the population, but
Yeah.
it is more than that. And I also talk about this a lot in the context of workplace policies. And, you know, in an ideal world, employers would care to invest in treating symptoms, in encouraging women to stay in the workforce, et cetera, because it's the morally right thing to do. In reality, they often will only do such an investment because it's worth their monetary investment, and it is. And so, if that's the only way that we can get them to care, that's fine because it is a
Yeah.
worthwhile investment. We talked about the costs of women not accessing appropriate healthcare. There's absenteeism, there's wasted money spent on healthcare costs that
Hmm.
are not appropriate treatment options. Women feel like they have to leave the paid workforce. And of course, that has huge implications, not only for their own financial security and gender equity, but also the overall economy. So
Mm.
if, even if you're not nice, if you care about money, you should care about women in midlife in your workplace.
Absolutely, absolutely. So bringing it back to the women, these invisible symptoms, because a lot of them are, it's not just hot flashes.
Yeah.
And the change that we see sometimes presented as personality changes
Mm,
and actually failing at life.
yeah.
Do you see that in the women that you work with?
I see that a lot. And we hear phrases like, I don't recognize myself. I don't feel like myself. I feel broken. Am I ever going to go back to who I was? A lot of despair. Um, that is very difficult to grapple with. And a lot of women describe feeling sort of disconnected from themselves, which is common in depression. And even if you don't meet the criteria for major depressive disorder or another diagnostic category, you deserve support. And no one should feel like they're alone in this. But because of the cultural aspects that we've been discussing, it is a lonely time. But that's why you and I
Mm.
do what we do, because we do want to normalize it. And just because something is common and normal doesn't mean you have to suffer through it. So I am very proud that my work is to support women through this, to help them feel less alone, and to help them advocate for whatever it is that they need to feel better.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that occurs to me, millennials particularly are facing that peak point in life. So careers, family, caregiving,
Mm-hmm.
and then you wrap on top of that perimenopause.
Yeah.
What do you think the impact is of that?
I would like to say that I'm hopeful. I am hopeful that my generation will say, "Oh, I don't feel good. Let's fix it," instead of going, more inwards. And I certainly don't blame the generations prior for not demanding better. They didn't know, right? My
Yeah.
mother's generation was the generation that was impacted by the Women's Health Initiative. And
Mm.
essentially, they were told there's nothing we can do right now. This is just your life. This is midlife. Get used to it. And millennials in general, as you mentioned earlier, we have access to information. We grew up learning the internet, digital media savviness, and we talk about hard things. We talk more openly than other generations, older generations, about things like mental health,
Mhm.
fertility struggles, the identity shifts that go on in motherhood. We are loudly demanding things like breastfeeding rooms and paid family leave policies
Mhm.
and flexible work. And I hope and think and expect and want my generation to say, okay, yeah, perimenopause and menopause is something that we have to deal with, and let's figure this out.
So we talked a little bit so far about relationships
Mm.
and the impact of relationships. And I've talked with Ramiro Castano last week about withdrawal, especially for men, where even if they have the language,
Mm.
even if they have that word perimenopause now, and they understand, okay, this is happening, they still have a tendency to withdraw and misinterpret what's going on. Do
Mhm.
you see that with your clients?
I do. I see it for both the man and the woman, because
Okay.
often the woman will, withdrawal is also a mood symptom in many ways.
Hmm.
They don't want to push themselves because they feel exhausted. So maybe they don't engage in social activities the way they would, or they don't want to talk about hard things. And so they withdraw emotionally. And then when the partner says, okay, well, she's, in a mood, I will also withdraw. There becomes a wedge in between. And I think taking space is hugely important and is a beautiful skill, but that doesn't mean you take space on a more permanent level, right? I think it's important to say, I need space for the afternoon. And then you come back and do that check in. How are you feeling? How can I help? What can I do to support you? I read or listened to XYZ, and here are some ideas, or we can not talk about it, whatever you need.
Yeah. And one of the things that I have started to use with men is sit, listen, believe.
Mm,
So sit and actually find time to sit.
sit together. That's so
Don't
cool.
don't do it over dinner.
Yeah.
Don't do it during chores. Actually find set aside some time to sit. And
Mm,
then for men to actually listen actively. Don't just wait your turn to talk. And then finally, even if they have done that research, even if they have watched that video, even if they've read that book, believe what their partner is telling them, because
mhm.
their partner's
Every
experience
experience.
is going to be different. Just because it's in a book doesn't mean that's what your partner is experiencing.
Yeah.
And I think when you get to that point, you can ask the right questions, like you
Mhm.
just said. What can I do for you right now, if anything?
Right.
Sometimes it's not a fix, and men immediately want to fix.
Yeah.
They want a solution that they can offer. And
Hmm.
sometimes the solution is, I just want you to sit there and listen, or I want you to leave me alone.
I totally agree. By nature, I am also a fixer. I like solutions, I like action items. And as I've grown as a therapist, I have learned that sometimes we just need to sit with the feelings. And I always tell my clients the goal of our work together is not to get rid of the negative feelings like sadness, frustration, anger, because those are natural human emotions. The goal is to not get consumed by them. And I think that applies to relational issues as well, right? And we can sit
Mhm.
with it and navigate through tough times together with effective coping mechanisms.
So, if you were to, if we, because we've kind of talked in some ways a little negatively about the things that happen, we've included some
Yeah.
positives, but just focusing on the positive side of entering perimenopause, and especially for millennial women, what do you see as the positive aspects for that?
Thank you for this question. I agree. And I tend to be an optimistic kind of silly person. And I don't mean to paint the picture of, hey, menopause is great, it's pink, it's all good. There are negative aspects. And we don't have to suffer through them. So I think that is a positive, right? Knowing that no matter how bad it gets, you're not alone, you're not untreatable, you have options and resources. So that I would start with. The second thing is the confidence and sense of self that I do see among every single woman who I have spoken with who's been through it. It's the getting through it, the perimenopause, that can feel difficult, but more often than not, the women that have gotten through it, even if difficult, say things like, I feel like the best version of myself. I know myself. I don't stand for bullshit anymore. My
Hmm.
tolerance for people who don't bring me joy is gone. And I know many women in this chapter of life who have really just become so confident and have started businesses and are really amazing. Plus, you don't have to worry about getting pregnant or getting your period. So that's always nice and
Yeah.
shouldn't be forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of positives, as you said, and I think it's important. You know, we do see a lot of that um, uh, giving up, putting up
Yeah.
with things, but it tends to be focused around Gen X. There's less of an expectation, and I think a societal resistance
Mm,
to millennials
yeah.
saying, "Yeah, no, I'm not. Yeah, that's not for me. I'm not going to do that anymore."
I was recently quoted in an article in USA Today where I said, millennials have been labeled the entitled generation. And I
Mhm.
say to that, sure, I think we are entitled to quality health care when it comes to midlife. And I'm sticking with it.
No, I think that's absolutely right, and I think that entitlement, especially as women enter perimenopause, I think that becomes more focused
Yeah.
on what they are entitled, as you said, the quality of healthcare, but I think also other things that they are entitled to
Mm-hmm.
as women, not just the healthcare piece, but the respect piece, the equality piece.
Yes. Being a full partner in the household when it comes to domestic labor and caregiving duties, knowing that you're entitled to be heard. And these are things that I think, men are entitled to as well. Of course, they're
Mhm.
entitled to
Yeah.
supportive workplaces, but we know that misogyny exists. And I think that we're done with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Down with the patriarchy.
Exactly.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of that. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, don't think we can make progress as long as that exists. I think that's a big block.
We certainly need to be in communities together and with allies of any gender, any age. I think
Yeah.
that when I talk a lot about this, people say, oh, menopause is years behind me, or oh, I'm in my 20s, I don't need to think about it. And I think that
Mhm.
women's health and women's rights are issues that everyone should be active in advocating for. And sometimes it's easier when you're not in the thick of it to lend your voice. And so I encourage everyone to do the right thing and to speak up for women.
Absolutely. I just want to come back to one thing you said, and you talked about men being more active um, in domestically. And
Mm-hmm.
there's two aspects to that. There's obviously the physical labor, but there's the emotional labor. And how do you encourage women that you're working with to encourage that in the men that they're partnered with?
This is one of my favorite topics, the mental load and gender equity in the home. We know that women, even when they out earn their husbands in the US, they are still doing the bulk of the caregiving, the domestic labor. We know that men who say they intend to have equitable partnerships, the good guys, often because of societal expectations, they end up with an inequitable partnership. And
Hmm.
that's not all their fault. That's because they don't get the parental leave. The school calls them first when the kid goes to the nurse's office or whatever it is. But
Mm,
similar to what I was saying about doctors, even though that might not be their fault, it's time to step it up and to make change. And I work with a lot of women on talking to them about talking to their partners about why certain things are important and how we can get rid of this idea that because she has certain standards or practices that she's nagging. I can't stand that word. And not one cannot always have things exactly their way all the time. And that's fine, because it's not necessarily that her way is better than his way when it comes to the dishes or whatever it is. But you do have to pick and choose. And Eve Rodsky does a lot of this work. And I work closely with the Fair Play Policy Institute, which I recommend everybody check out, because it's about thinking about your tasks, communicating who owns what, and then checking in. It's that check-in again, right? How's it going? What's your week ahead looking like? Maybe one's traveling. So, the pickup that usually goes to mom will go to dad or whatever. So it comes down to communication, but also the partner needs to care, to sit and listen, as you said.
Yeah. And I think one other aspect of that I've seen personally, but I've seen with other men, is when they do step up,
Mm.
it's important for the woman to step back.
So that's commonly referred to as maternal gatekeeping, and there is a lot of anxiety involved, especially in the young baby phase, for example. So
Mm.
women say things like, well, I'm better at the bath because he doesn't know how to do it. And I always point out, well, you weren't born with this skill, right? You learned it. And maybe you learned it because you got parental leave and he didn't, and that's unfair and not his fault. But now you have to let him, as you said, and let go of, your certain criteria and believe that the other person is capable, right? You didn't marry a dummy, presumably. You also have to assume that they love and care for the child in the same way, the same amount that you do. And there is trust involved. And there is a lot of kind of practice with low stakes activities that I encourage. And then we can check in and see how you feel.
Yeah. So as we start to close out, what would be your one, like if you could only give millennial women one thing to work on, what would it be?
It would be to know yourself and to recognize any changes, whether it's to your body, your sleep, your mood, and then don't be afraid to talk about it with your healthcare providers, with your partners, with your friends. I know that not everyone is as open as I may be about things like reproductive health, but I encourage you to find someone that you trust, that you feel safe with, to talk about it, because you don't need to go through anything alone.
Right. One more time, the book.
Millennial Menopause is available wherever books are sold, and I continue to do a lot of in-person and virtual events all over. So please reach out, and you can go to millennialmenopause.com to find out more and get a copy of the book.
And I will absolutely endorse that book because I've read it.
Thanks.
Um, so yeah, it's definitely not just for women.
Yes,
I
there's
want,
a
I
whole
want,
chapter for men. One of my favorite
yes.
lines is "Don't be a dickhead." But I love men. I love my brother. My husband we've been friends since we were 18, and then we fell in love, and he's such a good guy. My dad's a good guy. Men are an important part of this conversation. So
Yeah,
thank you, Simon, for all that you're doing.
thank you. And thank you for joining me. Bye.